Well, I think it's very likely, and we see it all the time. I mean, it's really dependent on who's using it. You know, if you've got terrorists like Islamic State, or you've got tyrants like President Assad of Syria or President Putin of Russia, who care little for collateral damage and civilian casualties, they will use them. I personally saw it a lot in Syria, where Assad would drop a lot of white phosphorus, which is an incendiary weapon, and burn towns and villages to get people out, you know, in a sort of medieval, sort of scorched earth type policy. Similarly, we've seen in Ukraine, Russia dropping a lot of incendiary weapons, a lot of white phosphorus on towns and villages to burn them down. And only at the moment, we're seeing the Russians use a lot of chemical weapons in eastern Ukraine. On an industrial scale, they're using something called chloropicrin, which was one of the first chemical weapons in the First World War. Some of the units I speak to are hit 2 or 3 times a day, and it's incredibly effective. So absolutely, in warfare, people will try anything for advantage. And my experience when I was the Peshmerga, who are the Iraqi Kurd military, when I was their chemical weapons advisor in the 2-year fight with ISIS, 2015, 2017, ISIS fired a lot of toxic industrial chemicals at us, like chlorine and ammonia, and also some crude chemical weapons based on mustard gas, mustard agents. So absolutely, quite frankly, it's used frequently. The other thing, slightly related to this, is where people blow up commercial factories that are making chemicals. And again, we've seen this in Ukraine, where Russia has bombed ammonia factories and factories making chemicals, you know, for a perfectly reasonable civilian means. But if you blow it up and spread it, it creates contamination, which can, if it doesn't kill people, it certainly makes them ill and can push them out of the area. And the third element, of course, is attacking power infrastructure, in particularly nuclear power infrastructure, which again, we've seen in Ukraine, and everybody will remember when the Chernobyl nuclear power station blew up in the 80s, the contamination that produced as far spread as, you know, North Wales in this country. So, yeah, unfortunately, in warfare, people will try virtually anything to try and get advantage and try and win. Well, they're not commonly used in war zones. In this particular case, the Americans claim that they used it because they saw how effective it was during the Malayan emergency, where Britain used it to effect. And it's an exfoliant. It kills leaves and stuff. So the reason behind it was so you could expose the enemy you're fighting. I mean, this is a long time ago. This is way before drones and clever surveillance devices and everything else, and was seen as a simple way to clear places where the enemy might be hiding. Of course, in Vietnam, it was done on a massive scale, but that was the basic, simple reason behind it, so you could better see your enemy, who you were trying to either defend against or attack. You have to take yourself back, 60 odd years. People were much less concerned about collateral damage, as we call it now, or the long-term health effects. That was not a key consideration. It was a very different time. They were just really focused on fighting and winning. But this herbicide is something very different to pesticides, which were the chemicals that gave people really the idea for chemical weapons. Actually, the deadly nerve agents that the Nazis developed before and during the Second World War were from pesticides, organophosphates, which we still use today. At the time, the Nazis realized that actually if you intensified pesticides, these organophosphates, you could produce a very deadly and effective weapon. But they weren't thinking about the second and third order incidents. I think in a slightly the same fashion, but it's the Agent Orange and the herbicides that the Americans and the Brits used were not being used as a chemical weapon per se to kill and injure your enemy. It was more to expose them. So, yeah, I am sure they would have had a vague understanding that these things are dangerous. Let's face it, if they kill trees and stuff, they're obviously toxic. But I don't think, I'm sure at the time they hadn't done any detailed studies on humans or animals to see the impact, but they weren't so worried. It is, something that's developed these days where people are far more worried about long-term health and avoiding casualties than they were then.